Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we find out if I'm psychic or just really smart. Let's get started. For this week's episode, unfortunately or fortunately, we are still talking about this whole ceasefire deal. And as much as I want to get away from this topic, it really is the most current issue. And it's kind of never ending with new information, new things coming out that you guys want to hear about. And so please forgive me that we're going to have to talk about it at least one more time. But I have a feeling there'll be more of these updates on the ceasefire. For anybody who has not heard the previous episode we did last week, my suggestion might be to go back and listen to that one first, because we will hear some things that are repeating from last time. So it may be a good idea to listen to that and then come back to this one. If you've not heard that episode yet, it's not vital that you hear it, but it might help. That being said, let's get to this week's episode about the ceasefire. And in order to understand what's going on right now in Gaza and with the whole ceasefire, I would like to give the microphone over to someone who is obviously very smart, someone who really understands this stuff. I like playing clips of people who maybe have a little bit more knowledge. And that person this week is me. Because clearly, I have some sort of skill that allows me to tell the future. Or as one of our favorite followers says, maybe it's just because I understand the history, and that history repeats itself, and therefore I know what happens in the future. So let's listen to a few things that I had said last week that seem to be coming true. But what we also know is the fact that Hamas will, mark my words, push the envelope. They will continue to do things they are not allowed to do in the ceasefire. They will play psychological and physical games, and they have always played these games during a ceasefire. Remember, we're dealing with a terrorist organization that does not play by any rules. Israel is expected to live up to this ceasefire to the letter. Hamas is a terrorist organization. No one expects them to do anything. That's quite an intelligent statement from me last week, because we did see that happening. Last week, we found out that the hostage negotiations required a list of living hostages that were planning on being released, that Hamas delayed, and then Israel fought back and said, we are not starting the ceasefire until we get that list. And this past week, we've seen multiple things happen, including and especially the fact that they have not lived up to their end of the bargain at least twice now. One of the first issues that Israel ran into this past week is the fact that as part of the deal, Israel was supposed to receive 4 civilian hostages, which included a bunch of women who were not soldiers. And then last minute, without much warning, if any, Hamas decided to change it and released 4 female soldiers, which, for the record, we are more than happy to get back, but that wasn't part of the deal. And these are ways that they like to switch and change things last minute in order to cause psychological damage, cause families to suffer, and they do it on purpose. And not only did they give 4 soldiers instead of civilians, they even changed the name last minute of one of the soldiers who was supposed to come home for another soldier who was coming home. And therefore, just, again, causing all kinds of problems for the families. This is their game. This is how they test how far they can push that envelope. And the second thing that they have done this past week, which breaks the ceasefire deal, is that they were supposed to offer the Israelis a list of living hostages to understand when they're going to be released, what their current condition is, alive, dead, sick, hurt, whatever it might be. And Hamas has refused to give that list. Hamas, again, always playing games, decided we'll give you a list of people who are alive and dead in conditions, but we will not give you their ages or their names. It'll be hostage number 1. This is their condition. Hostage number 2. That's no help to people. And we also don't know when or where they're going to be released, because there's supposed to be a list showing so Israel can tell families and be ready for them with medical care. But Hamas doesn't live up to their end of the bargain, literally ever. The world likes to pretend that there's some sort of negotiation partner on the other side, but clearly there isn't. And let's not forget that they lied and said some people were dead, who apparently just got released and are very much alive. Here is another clip from last week, which is actually crazy that I was so spot on with this. Here it is. Hamas, the political and military wing in Gaza, has officially made a ceasefire. Now, technically speaking, if a rocket comes out of Gaza, they get to pretend that was Palestinian Islamic Jihad who did that. It wasn't us. We didn't break the ceasefire. And if Israel wants to decide to respond in Gaza, then I guess they're breaking the deal, not us. It is pretty crazy how spot on I was about this issue, because it didn't even take a week before this happened. For anybody who's been following the ceasefire deal, and I had just mentioned earlier that they swapped out last minute one soldier for another, the one soldier who wasn't included in the deal, who was supposed to be included in the deal, do you want to know what Hamas said when they were asked why they broke the deal and not giving back the proper soldiers? They said, "We don't have that soldier. That soldier is with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Not our problem." Amazing. I swear I must be psychic. As much as I like to say that I'm psychic, the reality is I just have been through many of these ceasefires before. So I've seen all of these games many times. It's not unusual. It's a little sad that they're still playing them and it's so obvious, but I guess when you're dealing with a crowd of people who don't really care about facts or truth, or history for that matter, I guess it makes it easy to play the same game over and over again. This is one of the biggest issues that Israel constantly deals with. When Hamas purposefully breaks the deal, what does Israel do in return? Israel knows it's got its back against the wall and its people want the hostages out, rightfully so, and the world expects them to live up to the ceasefire that they had agreed to. And since we know the world never holds Hamas accountable for anything, it really is up to Israel if you're just going to accept them doing these stupid games, or are we going to end the games and just call off the ceasefire? Since the releasing of the 4 hostages, one of which was not the correct hostage, and none of which were civilians like they were supposed to be, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has decided that he will essentially pause the ceasefire to get back at them. If they're going to push the envelope, we're going to push the envelope. So after the first stage of people were released, people from Gaza were supposed to be able to go to the north and, to be honest with you, I don't know what, apparently it's completely destroyed, sit in a bunch of rubble, I guess. That is assuming you believe their propaganda. But nonetheless, that was part of the deal. But in response to the fact that Hamas has already broken the deal at least twice, maybe 3 times, depending how you count it, Netanyahu said that not a single person is going to go to the north until the deal is dealt with in a proper way. So since then, apparently, Hamas has said they will release that one extra soldier that was supposed to come out as part of the deal, and then people will be able to go north again. It is a very fine line that Netanyahu has to walk, but the reality is you can't allow them to keep changing the deal with no consequences, or else they'll keep pushing the envelope. Of course, this didn't stop the social media world from showing this massive line of people waiting to go to the north and how terrible it is that Israel is stopping them, leaving out the fact of why they're stopping them. And for my last clip of how smart or psychic I am from last week, take a listen to this one, and you'll be quite amazed to find out how right I was. But Hamas is still there, and it is not an accident that during the ceasefire they came out in full force to make sure that the people who would revolt against them know for a fact we are still here, we are still in charge, we still have our weapons, don't get any ideas about trying to overthrow us. Kind of like what we're seeing in Syria, Lebanon, and even Iran following the failure of their attacks on Israel. For some of my more avid listeners who maybe keep up with the news, you might have seen online videos that were going around showing Hamas doing exactly what I predicted they would do. They came out of their holes, they put on their little uniforms, they had their weapons, and they went and slaughtered many Gazan people. Anybody they claim is quote-unquote collaborating, which is code for you don't support Hamas and the things we do, and maybe you stand up for your own human rights and freedoms and things of that nature, which you don't get here. If you don't toe the party line and support Hamas entirely, they kill you. That's the one thing the people in the West don't understand. The people who are so supportive of the Gazan people, they say. Meanwhile, they are keeping Hamas in power, who actually murders people who want freedom. The oppressors are Hamas, and they're keeping them in power, the idiots in the West. And now that Israel is gone, been pushed back to the fringes of Gaza as part of the ceasefire deal, Hamas is able to reestablish their rule over the people by violence and force. So am I crazy smart about this whole thing? How did I know this would happen? Kind of common sense, mixed with a little bit of a history. But clearly we are seeing that Hamas is trying to regain its power since Israel essentially destroyed them. They've come out in full force. They're putting on these little parades and shows. Everyone has a weapon in order to make sure the public knows we are not gone, we are not destroyed, and we are still ruling this place. So don't get any ideas to try and stand up to us and have a free country. Things have not changed one bit, even though all our people are dead. So it's not at all surprising when some new news came out this week that some of you may have seen on our Instagram or around the internet. This week it's been reported by the Israelis, who were releasing the hundreds of Palestinian Arab terrorists, aka prisoners, that multiple prisoners from Israeli jails, keep in mind the Israeli jails that apparently treat them so badly, refused to leave the jail. Let me say that again. Palestinian terrorists who worked for Hamas refused to leave the jail. According to multiple reports, a number of them did get forced onto the bus by the Israelis, making sure they live up to their deal, of course. They said there'd be so many people who are put on a bus, they put them on the bus if they liked it or not. One person somehow was able to say, I don't want to go, please send someone else in my stead. And they actually did swap a person for that prisoner who chose to stay in Israeli jails, which is actually really funny when you think about these idiots in the West who are saying that people are being sexually assaulted in prisons, they're treated so badly. I'm sure you yourself have seen online when the Hamas propaganda compares the before and after picture of an Israeli hostage versus a Palestinian prisoner and how terrible they look. Obviously, those are all fake because apparently it's better to be in an Israeli jail than it is to be in Gaza right now. These people are choosing to stay in an Israeli jail rather than go back to Gaza. Now, this could be for a few reasons. Number one could be the fact that they are mass murdering their own people on the other side. So maybe if you don't agree with Hamas anymore, you've gone to prison for 20 years and you realized it's for nothing. Maybe you're not really so supportive. And if you go back to Gaza and try not to be part of Hamas, you will be killed. Or maybe, I hate to say, you were doing a little bit of collaborating while you were in jail. So maybe you don't want to go back and be killed for that reason, or even accused of collaboration. Let's be honest here. It's not like they have to take you to court and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you collaborated. Essentially, if you were in jail and anyone claims you collaborated, you're probably going to get a bullet to the back of the head. So I can definitely understand why an Israeli prison would be better than going back to that. Someone online recently made a very interesting observation, where they were realizing that people coming out of Israeli jails don't want to leave Israeli jails. This could also be the reason why we saw such mass surrenders of Hamas terrorists. We saw many times throughout this war lineups of half-naked men putting down their guns and walking towards Israeli soldiers surrendering. This could be because they actually would rather go to an Israeli jail and live there relatively well rather than going back to Hamas and explaining why and how they lost, possibly being considered a collaborator or being killed. So as much as I would like to say that I'm psychic, I'm really not. I'm a student of history. I've studied all of these issues and I've seen this happen over and over again. And as people say, if you forget history, you're doomed to repeat it. And we are currently repeating it, which is why it makes it so easy for me to tell you exactly what's going to happen before it happens. But I've also said on this podcast, the quote from Albert Einstein saying that if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. In a crazy situation this week, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, we'll find out. President Donald Trump announced on an airplane, not an official policy, I guess, just off the top of his head, that he has spoken to the King of Jordan and plans to speak to the government of Egypt and is going to, I guess, suggest or demand that the people of Gaza, for the first time in history, be taken out of Gaza and resettled in their countries, which makes a lot of sense historically, but we'll get to that in a second. As many of my long-term listeners know, I don't get into politics, so this isn't necessarily a pro-Trump, anti-Trump situation. I'm simply talking about the policy idea. Whether it's going to happen, not happen, I don't know. But what we do know, historically speaking, is that the people of Gaza were Egyptians from 1948, when they were conquered by the Egyptians during the 1948 war, until 1967, when the War of 1967 ended, and Israel tried to give Gaza back to Egypt, but they refused. So all of the people in Gaza technically are Egyptian citizens, or frankly were Egyptian citizens until they were stripped of that. So it's not that crazy of an idea for Egypt to take some responsibility for these people. The idea that Egypt is allowed to essentially supply the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza with nothing and put up a super max wall in between their country and Gaza, meanwhile leaving everything to the Israelis, and that way they can be blamed for when obviously things aren't getting better in Gaza. This might actually come to an end. I really don't know how he's going to get them to agree to this, because they very much dislike the Palestinian Arabs because of the destabilization they have caused in the past. Or if we talk about Jordan and the fact that they literally do not take any Palestinian Arabs in, despite the fact that they technically run the Palestinian Arab state, run by an Arab who's not Palestinian, mind you. But neither country will do anything more than lip service. They might send some aid in to Gaza, pretending to care, to show their populations, look, we love the Palestinian Arabs too, but they're not taking them in. And maybe with a little bit of financial threats or whatever you want to call it, Trump might actually force them to take people in. His plan, according to this random talking point he made on a plane, is to send 1.5 million out of the 2 million people to other countries. And I guess resettle them in those countries permanently? Again, none of this is thought through, which is, I hate to say, kind of typical for some of these policies that come out. I also don't know, really, how the Americans are going to force these countries to take people in, despite the fact that they were, in fact, Egyptians and Jordanians at one point. Maybe it's a financial penalty or a financial gain, but maybe it might work. In a funny side note, something that's really interesting that came out with this proposal is how many people were totally against moving the people of Gaza to Egypt in order to give them a better life, to resettle them. Their apparent excuse for not wanting to be resettled is the fact that this is their homeland. This is where they come from Gaza. But then at the same time, also claiming that they are refugees living in their homeland. How one could be in their homeland while at the same time live in a refugee camp. Try and explain that mental gymnastics. If you are a refugee, there's a place you can go live and stop being a refugee. If you're at home, then you can't be a refugee anymore. You kind of have to make up your mind, unless you are a Palestinian Arab and you have the UN on your side making tons of money off of you. But in the end, we can definitely see here history repeating itself. I'm not psychic. And my fear, as well as the fear that I've heard from many of our listeners, is the fact that the ceasefire that's happening might not last very long. As I also said on our previous podcast, that Hamas is only using this ceasefire so long as they need to rebuild and get themselves ready for the next fight. They are using their psychological torture. They have not told us how the Bibas family is, despite the fact that they were supposed to not only release the Bibas family, but at least give us an update on if they're alive or not. And they are continuing to play their games. And what's actually really pathetic about it is how many stupid people in the West believe these games and see these propaganda films and go, see, look how well people are treated. It's pretty mind-boggling if you think about it, how stupid some people can be. We killed 1,200 of your people, but at least we treated these 4 just before we let them out after 400 days pretty nicely. I feel a Nobel Peace Prize in their near future. I'd say this is a pretty bad psychic prediction, but honestly, in this day and age, I wouldn't even be surprised. I fear that this won't be the last time I'm going to speak about this ceasefire and updates. I kind of hope it's not every week. I would really like to get back to regular topics at some point soon. But we will see how this goes. We will see every week things change, the way they play their games, how Israel responds to it. But one thing I will say, staying out of politics a little bit, is now something has changed in the international world. The Hamas people don't have the support they used to have from the United States, as admitted by Anthony Blinken in one of our previous episodes. When he openly admitted when there's daylight between America and Israel, Hamas takes advantage. And now it seems like there isn't as much daylight between Israel and the United States, and therefore Hamas can't play their games as much anymore. Hopefully this episode was able to give you a little bit of insight into what I've been seeing for many, many years. So when you see stuff about what's going on the ground in Gaza, about the ceasefire updates, what you're seeing in the news, maybe you too can now be a little bit psychic based on the history. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.